Good morning once again, everyone, from my side. Today we are launching the first online research seminar called the TUM Seed Series. The purpose of the series is, first of all, to disseminate the research that TUM Seed researcher, doctoral student, and postdoctoral student conduct in our team, and to fostering academic exchange. So today we have, for example, Irfan from Oman. So we hope this is the first touching point to continue collaborating. And very briefly about the TUM Seed Center, I think it makes sense to give you a little bit of an overview about what the TUM Seed Center is all about. We are an academic exchange initiative, and we aim to conduct high-quality research at the intersection of sustainable energies, sustainable entrepreneurship, and sustainable development. It's a network of universities. One of them is TUM, and then 8 universities based in Africa, South America, India, and Indonesia. The core of our research takes place in this living labs. So this is what is peculiar of the Seed Center, which are mini grids that are constructed by partnering with the local universities and function as on the one hand, as a playground for researchers who can conduct their research on sustainable energies or on entrepreneurship in large-scale laboratories. And on the other end, these mini grids and living labs contribute to impact in research, because the mini grids are installed in remote communities which don't have access to electricity, so they can at the same time contribute to enhancement of the livelihood of these communities. But instead of describing in very detail what we do, I will show you a brief video that we have developed and emotionally as well explains what the TUM Seed Center is about. So allow me to share the video with you. It's only 2 minutes, and it explains the essence of the TUM Seed Center.
Electricity is not just the flow of electrons that can light a bulb or operate a toaster. Electricity is far bigger than that. With electricity flows the media, the internet, equal access to the education infrastructure. This is true empowerment. That was why I decided to join TUM Seed Center. I can make a difference.
Sustainable energies, entrepreneurship, and development in the global south. The challenge we address is 700 million people in the global south who do not have access to electricity.
When you look at the SDGs, with the absence of energy, you cannot fulfill any of the others. You can't go miles on education. You can't go miles on health. Poverty eradication.
Energy is a question of justice, to use energy to build entrepreneurial activities.
We are trying to tackle this through decentralized power supply. You put up systems that can provide power in that particular region.
This is a perfect example. Academics can really make an impact.
First and foremost, it is about academic exchange between TUM and the partner universities in the Global South.
TUM's collaboration with the Global South enables us to exchange knowledge, education, and also, most importantly, really to train and to educate the young talents.
We work together on the research projects from day one.
The reality is you become a family.
Hi guys, we are hiking.
Together with the support of the DAD and the BMZ, we can really make an impact.
We want to contribute to Sustainable Development Goal 7, clean and affordable energies for all.
It's really the cornerstone of our activities in the Global South.
So electricity is not just the flow of electrons. With electricity flows the cash, flows infrastructure, flows empowerment of people. And this is what Seed Center is all about, empowering people in every aspect.
Okay. I think this is, for me, always refreshing to look at that because it can very emotionally convey the purpose of what we're doing. And I think it's a nice way to introduce now our speaker for today. We will start with the presentation by Mohammed Beendanane. He's a PhD candidate at the chair of corporate sustainability, and his research, very in line with what the video has just presented, is conducted in the context of Kenya and deals with entrepreneurs trying to provide electricity in this context. And yeah, he will tell you everything about his current research in a second. And I'm also very happy to have with us Dr. Esther Salvi. She is a postdoctoral research fellow at IMD in Lausanne, Switzerland. She is very close to the Seed Center because she conducted her doctoral studies here at this chair with Professor Belt at the chair of corporate sustainability. And she will be the main discussant of Mohammed's research. So Mohammed will have roughly 30 minutes to present his project, current and ongoing project. Then Esther will start the discussion, and then we will open the floor to everyone who would like to share comments or has questions about how to conduct research on this topic and in this context. Without further ado, I will just welcome now Mohammed for his presentation. And thank you and good morning to all of those of you who have joined us now.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for the presentation. It's my pleasure to be here today for the first Seed series research meetings. And as you just said, that today I'm going to present my ongoing research projects, which is part of my dissertation, basically based on the case study from Kenya, based in Nairobi. Excited for the presentation today is stay on board with Make It Work, how ventures maintain legitimacy through pragmatic decoupling. And in here we're looking at startups or ventures that are trying to bring electricity to unelectrified communities in remote rural areas in Kenya. That's the context, and we're looking at it from the perspective of investors and how the ventures manage their relationship with the investors while remaining fairly unprofitable and not returning any profit to their investors. So in this project, the authors are myself and my supervisor, Frank Martin Bells. We worked closely together on this paper in terms of writing, but also in terms of data analysis and discussion of emergent insights. And I will walk you through this project. So we will start first by the motivation and the research questions behind. As you may know, what our aim is to advance theory in management or in entrepreneurship. So we had to kind of position our study within existing conversation or scholarly conversation on a specific topic that fits nicely with the empirics or the research context, which is mini-grids and energy access in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically in Kenya. And after conducting some exploratory interviews and visiting the field a couple of times, we came to realize that one of the interesting scholarly conversations that we could join using this context is on entrepreneurial storytelling. And for those who are not so familiar with entrepreneurship literature, entrepreneurial storytelling is a rather not mature, but a rather important research stream that focuses on entrepreneurial stories, which refers to stories that entrepreneurs tell to their investors or to their stakeholders so that they can make their new organization or new ventures familiar to the investors, closer to their understanding, and also to convince stakeholders to support them in their new endeavors. So entrepreneurial stories are really important tools for ventures to gain legitimacy. And by legitimacy, we mean the general acceptance or appropriateness of an organization or a venture. So entrepreneurs craft stories that appeal to investors, mainly by skillfully combining institutional and resource capital in the terms that they rely on institutional capital, that is the industry, the technology, the human resource capital, the business know-how and technical know-how, but also entrepreneurial capital in terms of the entrepreneur him or herself, in terms of his capacity or her capacity to make the venture successful. So entrepreneurs craft these stories by saying, for example, in our context, by leveraging on the technology of mini grids, that it works, that it's decentralized, that it can provide electricity to remote rural communities, that the technology works, and the entrepreneurial resource capital were have more to do with the entrepreneur himself and his capacity to run the business. So these skillful combination of these resources that are not necessarily tangible allow the ventures to become closer to the investor eyes and then gain legitimacy. However, regardless of how useful entrepreneurial stories are, they have a double-edged sword, in the sense that when you tell stories, you kind of give promises to your stakeholders, and these stories raise certain expectations that arise from the promises. Like in the case of private mini-grid ventures, which is a privately owned ventures that tries to build infrastructure in remote rural communities and make a profit out of it. So the expectation here is that the ventures, when they go to far hard to reach communities and build this infrastructure, they will manage to turn a profit. And that is the expectation from that investors are looking at, like, yeah, we invested in the ventures, so now are you going to be able to actually turn a profit or make a successful business out of this case? So expectations are often difficult to fulfill. And if they're not fulfilled, the legitimacy or the reputation or the credibility of the venture and the entrepreneurs are threatened. And this is an interesting paradox, where the same stories that entrepreneurs or ventures use to gain legitimacy are also a source of disappointment or threats to their legitimate position in the market. So scholars have studied storytelling and its effect on legitimacy. So, for example, a couple of scholars argue that in the emergence of legitimacy threats where ventures are unable to meet the expectations, they engage in revised storytelling. So they would revise their stories in light of the new reality and in light of their learning and so on. But also by replotting the story elements, considering the new expectations, and reconfiguring the links to the institutional and resource capital that I mentioned in the beginning. So to draw parallels with the context in Kenya is that when the ventures struggle to make a profit out of the business model of deploying privately mini-grids in rural communities, they would revise their stories. Okay, what can we do to make this business profitable? And then they would revise the story by saying, for example, yeah, it's difficult to be profitable. So our new story, for example, is to include more productive usage of energy and be more involved in the economic development of the villages, the remote villages where we operate, and that will ensure that we can be profitable. So these parallels are nicely tied to the context. But scholars as well have highlighted the iterative nature of entrepreneurial stories. So it's not a one go to tell just one story and then that's it. So it's a very iterative process. So ventures would iteratively tell stories to overcome the deception and maintain legitimacy compared to the initial story. And while revised storytelling and the iterative nature of stories have been quite extensively brought to the forefront of the scholarly conversation, the prior research on this specific topic is mainly conceptual, meaning is just theoretical and often not supported by empirical data. It also kind of stresses the challenges of revised storytelling by saying revised storytelling is challenging because not only you have to deal with new expectations, but you have to deal with the fact that you failed or your investors are skeptical because you didn't meet you didn't fulfill the promises given in the beginning. So it kind of, the literature leaves unexplored how ventures maintain or mitigate actually the challenges that arises from entrepreneurial storytelling that is revised. So it mainly focuses on the stories themselves, like what we said about replotting the story element or reconfiguring the contextual link to entrepreneurial institutional resources, and leave unexplored the actual strategies that ventures use in parallel to stories to maintain their legitimacy. And this is where we ask, we kind of position our paper by bringing more nuance to that specific question on how to manage the challenges of revised storytelling and what strategies entrepreneurs actually use so that they can, in parallel to revised storytelling. That's on one hand. On the other hand, some neighboring researchers on scholarly research on mostly on organizational legitimacy, which is closely related to entrepreneurship, but not technically the same. So when we looked at the literature on how organization in general, not necessarily entrepreneurial ventures, maintain legitimacy, we noticed that legitimacy management often looks that scholars in organizational studies often look at the macro level perspective of how legitimacy is maintained. So it's true, it's legitimacy maintenance, but it's from a very macro perspective where scholars would look at controversy or scandals and how that could affect organizations, but also institutions. And it's kind of because of this macro focus, which is not like the micro focus on the individual or the venture, it overlooks the promises that ventures give to their stakeholders, such as those arising from entrepreneurial stories. So even when we look at literatures from organizational studies, there is little theory or little empirical research that kind of answer the question of how ventures maintain legitimacy in the face of investors' disappointments. So we asked broadly the research question of how do ventures maintain legitimacy in face of investors' disappointment. So as I just explained, we kind of positioned the paper in between cultural entrepreneurship and venture legitimation. So cultural entrepreneurship has to do with entrepreneurial storytelling, and venture legitimation is a broad literature that focuses on new venture legitimacy and how ventures legitimate their actions and manage their legitimacy over time or at a specific point in time. So we're really positioned at the intersection of these two literatures, hence the very specific research question. So now how do we answer this question? So To answer this question, we adopted a qualitative, explorative, and inductive approach, following the tenets of grounded theory, which is on the more on the interpretive side of knowledge of developing theory. So because there is not so much theory already there in terms of legitimacy maintenance that explicate how stories are used to maintain how revised stories are used to maintain legitimacy, it is important to develop new theory to unpack this process and explain the intricacies. So qualitative and inductive approaches are well suited to explore such gaps in the literature. And the aim is obviously to develop process theory or build process theory following process data. And the setting is obviously the emerging mini-grid sector in Kenya as a research context. However, within the mini-grid sector, there are many ventures that we could choose from. So on venture to study, it could be a single or a multiple case study design, but we adopted a multiple case study design because it allows us to really isolate the process of maintaining legitimacy in the face of investors' disappointments, and really show the strategies in depth, the strategies that this venture, that the single case would use to maintain the legitimacy, which would have been more difficult to isolate if we adopted a multiple case study design, which introduces variance that we don't necessarily need to answer our research question. So a single case study seemed the perfect fit to explore this research question, and we adopted purposeful / theoretical sampling to select a venture that maintained legitimacy over time, although the venture itself was not able to fulfill promises, the investor expectations. So the unit of analysis is the process of maintaining venture legitimacy. So in terms of that is in terms of broad view of research methodology. So as I just explained, it's a single case study, and we focus on this in usually revelatory case of a venture anonymized solar grid. Solar Grid is a social venture that is based in Kenya, with headquarters also abroad in the US, and operating solar mini grid to address the electricity access problem in electrified rural areas. As you may know, solar mini grids are decentralized energy systems, so they are inherently infrastructure driven. And the aim of this decentralized infrastructure that is village-based or community-based is to provide sufficient energy for this whole individual that live in the community. Solar Grid, we view Solar Grid as an unusual case following Eisenhardt, because the venture actually managed to navigate different entrepreneurial stories, initial entrepreneurial storytelling versus revised one, and managed to maintain legitimacy. And we capture that by tracing the funding rounds that, despite the Solar Grid's inability to turn a profit, the venture managed to sustain a constant flow of financial resources. So we view that as a tangible proof that the venture remained legitimate to their investment. Brief overview on the technical side of solar mini grids, as you might see in the figure. So there is like the generating system, the distribution systems, but also the meters to invoice the customers. So there are this kind of infrastructure is pricey and requires substantial investment to not only buy the photovoltaics, the chargers, the batteries, the distribution system, but also to maintain customer relationships and to maintain the infrastructure itself in a good and functioning condition. So that shows how expensive and how difficult it is to run just one single mini grid, let alone mini grids dispersed across different rural communities with many other logistical costs that are involved. So solar mini grid run private companies can be quite challenging from the funds or costs perspective, which makes sense why we choose to focus on the costs and investors, the vendors and investor relationship, because it has financial implications. So in terms of now that we talked about methodology and why we choose the multiple case, single case study design and how it fits with the research question and the gap, we go now into more the analytical approach on how we approach the data analysis. So we collected data using semi-structured open interviews, but we also relied, so we have now around 12 interviews, and we also relied on archival documents, which we manually collected by checking the archives of the ventures. And the archival data really allowed us to analytically trace the evolution of the entrepreneurial story over time, whereas the interviews were more to enlighten how the venture, what the strategies the venture used to maintain its legitimacy whilst revising the entrepreneurial storytelling, and so on. So each data set is kind of serving a different process. The archival data are more to trace entrepreneurial stories, and the interviews with the entrepreneur, the venture employees, and the investors is more to make sense of how they view the venture as legitimate. So we adopted case and time ordered display. So which means that's how exactly we came up with the different phases and the different stories that the venture has used over time by time ordering the data and then unpacking the patterns that might otherwise be invisible if you don't use time ordered displays. We also used visual mapping and temporal bracketing. The visual mapping allows to really trace what happened in parallel to what across the timeline, as we can see, as we will see in the coming slides. And the temporal bracketing is more of defining the units of time with the temporality on which the focus of the analysis is. So as illustrative quotes, if we take a quote from early stage investors in 2016 and compare it to a rather recent quote from the same investor, we can see clearly that these are two different entrepreneurial stories. So in 2016, the first VC investor of the single case says, SolarGrid has developed a unique platform and a business model, to address one of the fastest growing electricity markets in the next decade, energy access in emerging markets. So we see that in the first quote, the investor is really talking about a business model and a unique platform and a fastest growing electricity market. So there is a clear indication that this is a platform-based business, and the business model is profitable or works by addressing this energy access in emerging markets. Later on, which means like around 7 years later, the same investor is saying, yeah, SolarGrid realized that building a swapping battery business in electric mobility is a better business for us than trying to figure out how to make these grids viable. Because they are uneconomic, SolarGrid can't justify continuing to operate them. So it went from a business model and a platform for energy access in emerging markets to a battery swapping business in electric mobility, because the grids are difficult to make economic, and there is no justification to keep running them if we're just losing money every month. So clearly we can see the difference between the initial and the revised storytelling echoed by the same investor across rounds of investment. So now we're going to talk about the empirical findings looking at a few of the analytical moves that we adopted. Here you see the visual mapping. So as you can see, in the visual mapping allows us to really see what parallels events were happening in time. So we looked at since the founding of SolarGrid in 2011 till, as you see in the second slide, till 2023, 24. And we mapped on the top of the timeline all the funding rounds and the money that the venture has raised. And on the bottom side of the visual mapping, we mapped kind of the achievements of the venture, but also the entrepreneurial stories that the venture were using. So in the beginning, as you see at the bottom here, in 2012, 2013, SolarGrid plans to pilot mini-grid. So it was more about piloting, and then later on, readiness to go commercial by covering 200,000 households, and then the first VC round was enacted, and then later on, if you see we're not going into the details. Later on, at the last round, we can see that at the bottom here at the last round in 2023, SolarGrid plans to expand the combined e-mobility CNI solar, CNI meaning commercial and industrial solar business in Kenya. So there is a stark shift between building mini grids in rural areas to more expanding to electric mobility in urban and rural areas, but also expanding to commercial and industrial installation of PVs across Kenya. So this was instrumental because it kind of tied the entrepreneurial stories to the venture rounds, to the VC rounds of investments, which led us to more a compact visualization of the temporal bracketing. So we bracketed this longitudinal data set using two main criteria. The first criteria is the VC rounds or the investment rounds. So each VC investment round constitutes a tangible element of legitimacy, maintenance, or attainment, because investors will not put money in a venture if they don't find it or view it as legitimate and worthy of investment. So that's the reasoning behind bracketing on these two rounds. And the other round, criteria for temporal bracketing is on the stories themselves. So what stories did the venture use prior to getting the founding rounds? So what are the elements that the venture has presented to its investors so that they can invest and be a shareholder in the business? So we can see in the founding, there is more of an initial story about profitable business selling electricity in rural communities. And then after doing the piloting and managing to get the first round of VC investment, there is a revised story, number one, which is profitable business selling electricity, but also providing socioeconomic development programs in rural communities, such as microfinance, helping consumers or beneficiaries be entrepreneurs, so that they can consume more electricity. That increases the odds of profitability. And then the later story, which is more of a profitable business in rural and urban clean electric mobility. So how this shows clearly that there is evolution, both in terms of the stories told across the timeline, but also across the venture funding route. So initially it was $20 million, and then at the later round it's already almost 30 million US dollar in the last fourth round, which is kind of 1.5 the value of the first investment. So that's the clear indications that regardless of not being profitable over a long period of time, the venture maintained its legitimacy across the different time periods. And of course, as you see here, the focus period, the study focus period, is really focusing on legitimacy threats, but also legitimacy maintenance, because that's where we think that most theoretical insight would emerge, because prior literature has already covered the challenges, how entrepreneurial stories are used to attract resources, We didn't want to focus on the early gaining legitimacy phase, which is the first phase here, which lasted about 7 years. We really want to focus on the period where there is more theoretical insights. So the whole techniques that we used in longitudinal or process data was only to isolate the actual period or the actual time period where we want to observe the strategies and the revised storytelling and how they interact. That doesn't mean that we're saying we're really developing process theory, but it's more of a grounded model that explains what's going on in terms of strategies and revised storytelling rather than full-fledged process theory. We used process theory technique only to isolate and identify the focus study period. So this is it's of a leap. So of how we went from temporal bracket from focusing on the study period to actually explaining it in theoretical terms. So we're still trying to fine-tune the data analysis to support this model with a grounded data structure. So I'm gonna explain briefly what theoretically made sense with the first round of directed coding. So we observed here process of legitimacy maintenance through pragmatic decoupling, and I'm gonna explain this in depth. So at the beginning, legitimacy is really gained if we look at the extreme left of the slide. You see the black box legitimacy is maintained, and then this link between legitimacy is gained and struggles to it has already been theorized in the literature. And that's what we cover about revised storytelling. So the revised storytelling managed to, by revised storytelling, the ventures has managed to maintain their legitimacy. So, but what we theorize on is from the struggles onwards. So the struggles would generate investor disappointment, meaning that investors are not so happy by the fact that the ventures didn't meet the expectations, and ventures to manage this disappointment, they engage two things. First, it's revised storytelling, as the literature says, but it is not enough to just revise the stories. We argue that you need also to provide what we call pragmatic accounts. So by pragmatic account, we refer to the justifications and the reality grounding of what happened while the venture was trying to enact the entrepreneurial stories, and we capture them through three different levels. So ventures would contextualize the struggles, like give meaning to the struggle by linking it to the context. For example, justifying the difficulty with the context, but also relating to industry peers by saying, we're not the only ones struggling, everyone else is struggling. So they kind of contextualize it to industry peers, but also to the specificity of doing business in such a difficult market. And then the second level is capitalizing on experience. Instead of focusing on failure, our data shows that the ventures would actually highlight the experience gained rather than bringing to the forefront the failure itself. We failed that we have gained experience that we can capitalize on by engaging in new entrepreneurial endeavors. And the third element of the pragmatic account, or the third type of pragmatic accounts, is enacting entrepreneurial flexibility, in the sense that ventures would remain flexible by trialing new products, but also by cooperating with selected partners that would help them enact this entrepreneurial flexibility. So these three accounts, contextualizing struggle, capitalizing on experience, and enacting entrepreneurial stories, coupled with the actual revised story, will help the ventures manage the disappointment, but also lead investors to view revised storytelling positively, which means they're more likely to believe and to sign in and to support the new revised story. And by these, pragmatic accounts are are also a strategy for the venture to mitigate the challenges that arise from revised entrepreneurial storytelling, and that will lead to legitimacy to be maintained. And again, this is like an iterative process in case, again, there are struggles to enact entrepreneurial stories. The same process, we expect the same process to be to unfold. And the last element over here, which is more tacit in this figure, is the pragmatic decoupling. So we also observe that the ventures decouple their inability to meet expectations, which means they dissociate their failure from their expertise or business know-how. So instead of saying we failed, so they would say we failed not because we don't know how to be entrepreneurial, or we don't know how to run mini grids, or we don't know how to make this technology work, but it's out of our control, and the pragmatic accounts allow them to kind of decouple their failure from their business know-how. That's our business expertise and knowledge has nothing to do with the failure. We're still good entrepreneurs, we're still valid ventures, we're still an appropriate venture that is worthy of investment. So they kind of decouple these two. But also the model is kind of more of a coupling, decoupling, because ventures would couple revised storytelling with the pragmatic accounts as a strategy to manage the challenges that arise from entrepreneurial stories, but at the same time decouple their failure from their business know-how. And we believe this is the theoretical argument or theoretical explanation of how ventures maintain legitimacy or manage the challenges of revised storytelling to maintain legitimacy. So in terms of the new concept that we bring to the table in this model, so we think that it is conceptually distinct from entrepreneurial stories on 3 different levels. First, on the temporal orientation, stories are more forward-looking, that envision future states, while the accounts are backward-looking, focusing on past states. The fundamental component of entrepreneurial stories is mainly promises that are given to investors, while the pragmatic accounts are really centered on justifications rather than promises. And also the stories and accounts are different in a sense that they're not constructed the same way. So in entrepreneurial stories, investors are more passive. They just receive the stories. So it's venture-centered. The entrepreneur crafts the story skillfully, as we said in the beginning, and then deliver it to the investors or to the stakeholders, whereas the pragmatic account really engages the investors themselves, because in a sense, it's mutually constructed between the ventures and their investors. The investors must buy in the pragmatic account and believe in the pragmatic accounts before they can view the venture as legitimate or appropriate. So these are some conceptual definitions. We can go deep there later if you have any questions. Thank you for your attention, and yeah, I'm ready to hear Esther's feedback and to discuss with you more in detail about this first paper dissertation.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I know I have only 9 minutes, so I will try to be brief, and I'm not sure how we want to do it to open it up. So Alessia, I start, and I'm also happy to exchange more with you, Mohammed, later as well. So
yeah, I would just want to maybe say,
yeah.
if anyone in the room has questions for Mohammed or comments, you can just type them in the chat. So because we don't have enough time to open the room later, but at least they will stay in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, so it was great to see the development and to hear from you about the process and how far you have gone. So congratulations, first of all, for the great development of the idea and for the first model you have put together, which I think has really a lot of potential and I liked a lot. Take my comments with a pinch of salt, because I mean, you are the owner of this work. You have been working on this for, I think, at least 2 years now. So I'm coming in the last minute, just hearing the presentation and trying to make sense. So some of the things I will say may make sense, some others may not. Just follow, you know, also what resonates with you. So I was reading the paper as well prior to the presentation, and there you focused a lot on pragmatic legitimacy. I think in the presentation, the focus on pragmatic legitimacy in particular was not so strong anymore. And I think in a way is good, because I was wondering, reading the paper, why so much focus on pragmatic legitimacy and not on the other types of legitimacy like moral and cognitive? So I think that, you know, how you are presenting the model right now makes sense. Also, when we look at the theory, still, I'm not sure that we can talk about legitimacy in general, because legitimacy, especially when you look at the work by Fisher, I think there is a paper published in JBV around that. Legitimacy is really dependent on the eyes of the stakeholder you refer to, right? So we have different types of legitimacy when we look at different stakeholders. In your case is investors, but still different types of investors may have different legitimacy perception. And what I'm saying is, maybe it makes sense to you to differentiate what type of legitimacy are maintained, if you want to use the word maintain, over time. Is it all about pragmatic legitimacy, and how are this story really coupled with other types of legitimacy as well? So cognitive and moral as well, I would say. So I would put a little bit more nuance there and shadow. I like a lot, and I think that you're right when you say that there is an untapped potential and a gap when we look at how ventures maintain legitimacy in the face of investors' disappointment, because I didn't see so much there, and these failure stories in a way are not very popular. So I think that strengthening this argument makes sense. What I would also hear a little bit more is, what I would also like to hear is, yes, there is a gap, but what we can learn, right? And I believe that there are a lot of relevant implications that you can also build your argument on and theoretical motivation on when you talk about what other ventures can learn when facing these type of issues with stakeholders. And then I'm thinking, first of all, there are many possibilities and directions to go. And I believe that, yes, a process study may make sense, but I would also consider a variance alternative as a suitable possibility, because you may have different approaches over time in this difficult sector where failure is common. And maybe there is not only pragmatic decoupling, there is also pragmatic coupling. And it would be nice to compare when you look at multiple ventures. I'm not saying you have to do it, but can be a possibility, and I would not exclude it completely. And then I'm thinking also, when you look at this intersection, and maybe here comes my background, right, and what is relevant to me in my research. It's all about providing electricity, right, at the beginning, and then providing immobility and changing the stories and so on. But I think what is missing, and probably this is the issue and also related to the failure then of the business, is the community, right? So what is the perspective of these communities, and how does the venture build legitimacy or not toward their beneficiaries? And I believe that probably a different trajectories could be envisioned in the time when the venture would have co-created the story with the community, and they didn't. They just, you know, really approached the entire stories from a very top-down perspective. And so there is even a decoupling from the community in a way, right? So probably, you know, working differently in that sense would bring to different results and not lead to the need of revising the story completely. So I think it would be nice along your process to identify how the community was involved and not involved, and how this led to nuanced strategies in terms of building the stories and obtaining legitimacy. So this is also something I was noting down when hearing your story. And yes, so your final process, both in the paper but also in the slides, I think is going in the direction of being a process, but it's not really a process yet, right? So you still have boxes and arrows, and it's, at least to me, very much causality oriented, right? If you do that, this is the consequence. And if you do that, this is the consequence. So I'm thinking if you can build, and here you can draw on the work of Tima Bansal, a more system process where you show what events matter in the process over time and how entities, you know, change meaning over time. So it's not just causes and consequences, but really to have more emphasis on the events and on the circularity of these constructs over time. So I don't know if I'm making sense, but I have a lot of notes I'm happy to share. And exactly, so I was thinking about these points. And especially, you know, from a system perspective, when you don't include and don't co-create with community, does this lead, and maybe this is related to the implication, does it really lead to pragmatic failure of the original business ideas and the need of revising the story? Because I think that this failure comes from not integrating the reality on the ground into the business model and into the stories. So yes, this is my feedback overall. I have many more points, and I think there is much to like in your paper, but I would like to see how it develops further as well.
Thank you so much, Esther. I agree with you. I think I purposefully didn't include the communities because I didn't want to add more variance on terms of how they are perceived, or the legitimacy towards the community, but it's a valid point. And I agree with you. It's a very top-down approach. It's like the entrepreneurs and the investors deciding what works for them and what works best for the communities. But I keep that for a second paper.
Okay. Unless the reviewers share my opinion, you know, because then we have
hope not. I mean, if it's social entrepreneurship scholars, they would actually raise it. But I think in cultural entrepreneurship, I hope they won't.
Yeah. And you never know. It's very subjective.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mohammed, for the great presentation. I really enjoyed listening to it, even though I've heard it many times. It's always exciting. And thank you so much, Esther, for the valuable feedback you have provided. And in general, I think the feedback that you have given can be applied to many other papers, because you have touched upon like key points that every time we need to think about how we can look at theory differently, and how we keep our work relevant and critical as well. So I'm really happy that you have joined us and really grateful. I will wrap up the session now and go to open the next Zoom session where Prashant will present his work. And thank you so much again. And thank you for all of you who have been listening to Mohammed's presentation. Looking forward to keep in touch.
Thank you so much, Alessia. And I'll share my deeper feedback with you, Mohammed.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.